Okay, we are going to continue our reading of Chapter 2 of Volume 1 of Cambridge Ancient History. This is not just going to be a straight reading. I will be looking up words I don't understand, sometimes looking for pictures of the things that they're talking about. And because my main channel is about learning English, I will be trying to summarize in very simple terms each paragraph that we go through. So, but that's good for, even if English is your native language, that's good for uh, reconsidering what they're talking about and contemplating what they're talking about in simpler terms. So I don't see why you would have any problem with that. Just even if English is your first language. So now, if you are watching this with me as I'm doing this live, then I encourage you to make comments or ask questions or ask me to read something again or ask me to look up the definition of a word if you're not sure what it is. So I will definitely be looking at the comments, paying attention to the comments. All right, so let's start reading. All right, we're in chapter 2 of volume 1 of Cambridge Ancient History, and this is sort of in the middle of the chapter that we stopped at. So this is regional types, the Tripolier culture. To present intelligibility, the next two phases of the Neolithic culture of Europe and the crises which introduced them, it is necessary to range further afield into regions hitherto unaffected. All right, so they're saying to talk about the next two phases of Neolithic culture in Europe and the crises, the bad things that happened to them, we have to look at other areas around it. It's necessary to talk about areas surrounding Europe that so far have not been affected by these kinds of climate changes or tragedies, catastrophes. So far as is known by the emergence of broad-headed man, either in Asia Minor or in Alpine Europe, his relations with the Syrian highland and with Egypt have been discussed already, and the circumstances which hindered his general extension along the North African coast. We shall see later by what stages his culture, though not necessarily his race, passed southeastward. So passed southeastward towards Southeast Asia? Is that what they're talking about? Or Central Asia? And eastward into a region of the ancient painted pottery culture of Susa and Anau. Okay, so let's even, I don't know what Susa and Anau are. Maybe we can find that on a map. How do you spell that? Susa and Anau. Susa and Anau. Well, it seems like Mesopotamia. I mean, that seems to be the area. Let me show you this on the screen. That almost exactly because before I think I wanted to look at a map of Mesopotamia, and that seems to be the exact same area. Am I missing something? What is this? No, I guess. Well, okay, I guess that's the region. Although I don't see that actually written anywhere. I see these. I see Persia. I see Elam, but I don't see the Susa and Anau. All right, but that seems to be, every single map seems to point to that, so I guess that's the area. And we shall see that there is reason to believe that the site of Anau reveals that painted culture in oscillation between the highlands and the northward steppe, and indebted for the technique of its form as well as of its ornament, partly to wood-using foresters, partly to leather-using pastorals from the steppe or its oases. It does not need much imagination to suggest that a type of steppe or oasis culture of this kind is unlikely to be confined to one section only of the steppe margin, and that it is most likely to be recovered at any section of that margin where the steppe is bounded by mountain and forest as abrupt as the Kopet Dag above Anau. So maybe if we look for Kopet Dag, that will give us a very precise Kopet Dag. Kopet Dag Mountains. Yeah, it's around Iran, Turkmenistan. I'll just show you on the map here. See, so that's eastern Iran with the border of Turkmenistan. It was therefore no surprise to geographers when the discovery was announced of a painted pottery culture on a number of isolated sites distributed oasis-like over the Transcarpathian steppe, but the Dnieper and the Danube, between the Dnieper and the Danube, and supplemented by the other groups, one along the north side of the Carpathians throughout Galicia, and the other occupying sites in Siebenbürgen on the reverse flank of the Carpathian Arc, as Sauza and Musian stand on the reverse flank of the North Persian highlands, looking over Mesopotamia and exploiting its lowlands, just as the Ciscarpathian sites spread down from Siebenbürgen into the Hungarian plain. Like the culture of Anau, the Tripolier culture, so called from the best known of the Transcarpathian sites, has two main phases. In both, the dead were burned, and it has been inferred from this that the people were of Alpine origin, but this does not necessarily follow, and the racial question may be left open for the present. The first phase seems to be purely Neolithic. Its decorative painting, like the first style of Anau, is simply geometrical, and it seems to be limited to the flat land, except one brief incursion into the earlier Neolithic culture of Thessaly, with which it is at present linked only by a few casual finds in Macedonia and Bulgaria. The second, which is separated from the first by a considerable pause, during which sites were evacuated and reoccupied, as at Anau, shows marked development of its vase forms, and still more decided change in its decoration, for in the interval it had acquired an empirical, though not very intelligent, acquaintance with the curvilinear ornaments of the Danubian band pottery at a period when the latter was already strongly influenced by the Bosnian spiral designs. The painted Transcarpathian spirals, however, never reproduced their prototypes with the close understanding of their geometry which characterizes the Bosnian school, but are introduced haphazard in bizarre confusion among the triangles and other line schemes which were already traditional. Which one are they talking about here? I've kind of lost. I want to look it up and see what it looks like. The second, which is separated from the first. Wait a minute. The Tripolier. Maybe if I do Tripolier pottery. I just want to see what that looks like. Tripolier pottery. I'm kind of intrigued because they call it confused or haphazard, so I'm just wondering what that looks like. I guess I can see if this is an example, and I'm not sure if it is. but Cultura Chukuteni. I'm not even sure what language that is, but let's see. Well, these are, if these are examples, yeah, this says Tripoliate culture here. It is kind of a little bit confusing. They're kind of cool. I like them, but they are, well, that's Afghanistan. Let's see. I don't know if that's part of it. Okay, I guess we get the idea, though, looking at these pictures. It is. It's a little bit whimsical. Okay, let's see. After a fairly long existence, to judge from the depth of the deposits of the Galician and Romanian sites, though there is nowhere the vast depth of debris which is common to Anau and Susa, the Tripoliate culture ceases abruptly and uniformly. Its sites were deserted and not reoccupied, and the cause of their evacuation is indicated by the occurrence over the whole region of their distribution of burial tumuli in a late phase of the Neolithic ascribed by Russian observers to the Kurgan folk or red ochre people. What is tumuli? Tumuli. Tumuli. Wait, I don't even know how to say it. Tumuli. Tumuli. Let's see. Tumuli. Tumulus, an ancient burial mound. Oh, okay. Tumulus. And I guess the pronunciation is, well, tumulus.
Tumulus.
But they don't have the plural. But I guess it's probably tumuli. Or tumuli. Okay, so they're ancient burial mounds. Well, I wonder if that's what, because I grew up in Illinois and they have these mounds, which don't have very creative names. I think they just call them mounds. But I wonder if that's a similar thing, or if this is just specific to... I don't see why that term wouldn't apply also to the mounds in Illinois, but who knows? Okay. The red ochre people, who had long been an occupation of the central steppe, but seem to have been held aloof from the Tripoliate folk along the course of the Dnieper. The occasion and cause of their eruption can only be guessed. Oh, now it has a footnote about Kurgan. Kurgan is a local word for a burial mound. These people will be hereinafter described as the tumulus folk. The red ochre with which they besmeared their dead has been thought to be a survival of Paleolithic, perhaps Solutrean observance. All right, so the occasion and cause of their eruption can only be guessed. I'm just going to recenter this. For it cannot at present be correlated exactly with other events, though curiously enough, pottery resembling the latter Tripoliate style appears suddenly in Thessaly at a longish interval after the first incursion. Whether we measure it in phases of the local styles or by the depth of superimposed settlements, it may represent an arrival of a dispossessed folk from beyond the Danube. It is certain, however, that once let loose on Romania, the tumulus folk were checked westward only by the Carpathians, and that southward they crossed the Danube, spread their tumuli widely over Bulgaria and Thrace, and penetrated northwestern Asia Minor, where their tumuli overlooked the Hellespont and follow the Sangarius Valley as far as the Phrygian Plateau. It has been suggested with some probability that it was they who destroyed the second city at Hisarlik, At all events, one skull from this city, wholly different from its contemporaries, closely resembles the tumulus folk type, and if so, their eruption would be approximately dated not later than 2000 BC, and would range with other great movements which were in progress about the time. While the left wing of this eruption from the steppes swung southwards in this fashion, the right or northern wing pressed on outside the Carpathians, scattering the Tripolier folk of Galicia into Silesia, Moravia, and Bohemia. The effects of this movement must be followed at a later stage, page 101. Other survivors of the Tripolier culture seem to have taken refuge with their cis-Carpathian kinsmen and to have introduced disorganized elements of their culture, and especially their painted decoration, rather than widely within the Danubian region, from northern Serbia to Bohemia. Perhaps this dissemination had already begun from the cis-Carpathian sites, for the relative dates are uncertain. But the general similarity of these derivative painted techniques rather points to a single impulse of not very early date. The Culture of the Northeastern Steppe, Part 6. While in Western and Northwestern Europe the passing of the Old Stone Age can be traced in fairly full detail, the record is as yet less copious in the East. Romanian and Russian studies of post-glacial deposits make it certain that the deposits of Less, which indicate dry steppe and desert conditions, though generally continuous, were interrupted several times by moister periods which allowed soil to form far out from the Carpathians towards the Dnieper. Near the Carpathians and further south towards the Balkans, not only are these layers more numerous, but they can be correlated with flood wash of the lower Danube and other Romanian rivers, and with other soils so richly impregnated with the vegetable matter that they are regarded as evidence for forest like that of the Carpathian foothills, but extended for some distance into the plain. The forest regime attained, therefore, here too, and more than once in post-glacial time, a wider extension than now, and the changes of climate which it presupposes are indicated also by wider distribution of swamps and other shore deposits of an enlarged Black Sea. As similar oscillations are established on the low ground between the Black Sea and the Caspian at Anau, and around the southern foothills of the Ural Range, it may be inferred that the old Sarmatian sea basin still exercised its moderating influence over the whole Eurasian lowland, whenever the westerlies shifted far enough north to supply it with rain. But these oscillations only affected the margin, and meanwhile it was only gradually that the Asiatic forest, already mentioned in other connections, was enabled by the shrinkage of the Scandinavian and Ural ice caps to spread round the northern edge of what seems to have been continuously steppe or desert, at all events, its central area. This region has already been suggested, page 51, as the probable reservoir of the Solutrean hunters who intruded in Western Europe at the end of the Aurignacian period, and as their probable refuge when they withdrew, with the steppe fauna, when the Magdalenian moisture set in. That they did not permanently lose access to Central Europe is clear from the occurrence of similar long-headed individuals in the Offnet burial place, mixed with early representatives of the new broad-headed folk of the alpine forest region, and that their culture penetrated at one time right across the Iranian section of the highland zone, is suggested by the discovery of implements of the peculiar Solutrean technique on sites overlooking Mesopotamia, and even in the Nile Valley, though the occasions of these deposits cannot yet be dated. Many of the later Paleolithic folk on West and Mid-European sites had the habit of supplying their dead with a quantity of powdered red ochre, in what belief as to its efficacy we can only guess from occasional instances of the same custom among modern savages. There is obviously symbolism in so durable a representation of blood. It is therefore of the first importance that the same practice is habitual among the earliest inhabitants of the Eurasian steppe, a tall, heavy-built, and long-headed race not very different from those Western types, burying their dead in surface graves and marking these with earth mounds, the only possible monument in a treeless and stoneless land. In a stoneless less land. So less is a type of ground material. It isn't very fertile. So less land, Loess, is yellow, and I guess it isn't very fertile. It doesn't have a lot of stones, and it doesn't have trees. So it's not a good place to build monuments, or it's not an ideal place to build monuments if you want your monuments to have stones or wood. These mounds, for which the local word is kurgan, do not seem to begin until the fine Solutrean technique had been lost, and their earliest contents are more roughly worked implements and hemispherical pots of clay. Durable substitutes for the simple bowls of gourd or leather available to a prairie folk, as horse bits, and later on fragments of wooden cars on wheels, are found in these mounds. We must infer that the horse had been domesticated, and that we have here an early phase of wagon-dwelling culture, which still occupied this grassland when it was visited by the Greek explorers later on. Dates for these two inventions, locomotive animals and wheeled transport, cannot as yet be fixed, but they presuppose a combination of level, unobstructed country with the presence of the wild horse and the access to parkland timber supply, which is nowhere so fully realized as in this region. And at no period so favorably even there as in the late Paleolithic phase of moist climate, and consequent encroachment of such parklands far out into the steppe wherever its dusty soil was tolerant of trees. At the climax of the moist phase, we have probably to picture this region wholly grassland at its center, wholly encircled by forest, and within its southern half invaded by the swampy shores of a continuous Ponto-Caspian lakeland. It is not the purpose of this chapter to deal at length with the history of language, for though the periods of this may be assigned an order of sequence, they can seldom be dated because words, unlike implements, do not fall on the ground after use. But it may be noted here that the population of a region so long secluded, so vast in itself, and so absolutely devoid of internal obstacles can hardly have failed to acquire a fairly uniform vocabulary for such elements of their common experience and culture as the open sky, sun, moon, and stars, open water with some sort of boat, and swampland with geese and ducks, open grassland with cattle and horses, but also parkland trees with axes to fell them, and gourds for vessels, and the structural details of the wagon home for its journey over the paths and fords. Whether such people had also knowledge of the simpler agriculture would obviously depend on eventual intercourse with kindred men of the parkland, or with some other culture on the forest margin or beyond it. For on the grassland itself, as every nomad knows, even to scratch the surface may be to wound irremediably the delicate film of vegetation on which depends all. Such vocabulary seems to have been among the oldest common possessions of Aryan-speaking folk, and there now is a general agreement as to whatever their subsequent adventures, the original speakers of this type of language probably inhabited this region, while some observers go so far as to identify them with the tumulus folk. Part 7. The Culture of Anau and Susa. We reach next in our survey of early Neolithic cultures the eastern section of the highland zone, separating the northern steppe from the lowland of Mesopotamia, where the earlier phases of civilization have been already noticed. In this eastern section, the record is still fragmentary. In spite of the brilliant work of the French mission in Persia, Paleolithic culture of the normal types has not been detected. This is what would be expected if the southward shift of climate clothed its abrupt escarpments on either hand with forest, impenetrable by hunting folk. At most, during a climax of drought, there might be occasional incursions, such as the rare occurrence of Solutrean types of implements to the southwestward has suggested already. The survival of dark-skinned folk akin to older races of India and beyond, in the more extensive and better-watered ranges of the southwestern margin, suggests that this region long retained the character rather of a westward appendage of that greater southeasterly region than of the eastward extension either of Africa, Arabia, or even the highland zone, and the intense glaciation of the Armenian and northwest Persian mountain knot gives a reason for this long isolation from the west. Scanty human remains from Susa and other sites on its southwestern margin, and from the ancient site of Anau on its northern, agree in supporting this notion of its early human population. And at Anau, in particular, there is evidence that this type persisted even where it would at least have been expected, far into early historic times. Further south, the same type seems to be figured in the Sumerian art of Babylonia, early in the 3rd millennium. The remarkable analogies between the earliest culture at Anau and the Susan group of sites need not therefore surprise us, nor the remote antiquity to which this common culture appears to go back with essential continuity of development. For the lacuna between the second and third phases at Anau has been shown to be due to an encroachment of northern steppe desert, which evacuated the site temporarily without destroying the civilization, of which Anau was seldom more than an outpost. The unusual depth of continuously deposited debris on all of these sites at Susa, 27 feet for the first culture and nearly 50 feet for the second, at Anau, 45 feet for the first and 40 for the second, is presumptive evidence for very long duration, unless the contrary can be proved. We may compare the 25 foot of pre-Minoan Neolithic debris at Knossos and the occurrences of pottery at 50 and 60 feet below the present floodplain of the Nile. The second culture is succeeded after an interval of desertion by a third 59-foot thick, the later part of which contains objects not much later than 2000 BC. Without accepting, therefore, estimates based on rate of accumulation on later sites and in other regions, it is permissible to regard the beginning of the Susa-Anau cycle of civilization as falling within the same scale of time as is indicated by the Baltic sediments for the close of the European Ice Age. Comparison of the most recent reckonings reveals indeed very striking similarities. Breasted, relying on the actual rate of alluvial deposit in Egypt, dates the beginning of the present Nile alluvium and the first human occupation of it 60 to 80 feet below the modern surface, to about 18,000 to 15,000 BC. A second floor of occupation at 35 feet to about 10,000 BC, and the earliest tombs still exposed along its edge to about 4,000 BC. Baron de Guerre study of the annual increment of laminated clays in the Baltic area suggests 20,000 BC for the retreat of the Scandinavian ice from the German plain, 15,000 BC for the release of the south end of Sweden, which very soon received Solutrean immigrants from that south, and 8,000 BC for its northern districts. Pumpelly and Huntington begin the first settlement at Anau in South Turkestan at about 9,000 BC, the second, which succeeded it, at about 6,000 BC, and the third after an interval of desert drought, about 5,200 BC, ending with another drought at about 2,200 BC. De Morgan and Montelius allow 20,000 years for the whole series at Susa. Evans and Montelius 14,000 for that at Knossos. The drought which evacuated Anau between 6,000 and 5,000 BC would thus correspond with any period of elevation and more continental climate in the Ancillus period of the Baltic area, by which time the Eurasiatic tundra and forest belt had completed their fusion with the Western European, and were allowing Mongoloid folk to penetrate into the Balkan area. The material cultures of Susa and Anau present close similarities. The Susa is described below, page 361. At Anau, the first culture in the lower part of the northern Kurgan site begins likewise with handmade pottery of simple but shapely forms, based partly on leather work, partly as usual on a still older pot fabric. The decoration, carefully applied in dark paint, is borrowed from other techniques, and is already so conventional that its ancestry remains doubtful. The material culture of these folks. That is, must be considerably older than anything deposited on this site. The principal implements are small flint flakes, probably for insertion in a wood haft, like those which appear in Western Europe late in the Paleolithic decline and at the beginning of the Alpine lake culture. And perforated mace heads fashioned from pebbles of hard rock, such as occur in the earliest Nile Valley settlements and also in lake dwellings in the Alps. The huts were of mud brick. Their rectangular plan suggests the use of timber for roofing. Spindle whorls attest the arts of spinning and weaving. So we're just wondering what I'm guessing in my head what a spindle whorl is, but now I just want to see a picture of it. Spindle whorls. Spindle whorls. That's kind of what I thought it was. I'll just bring up a picture in case you don't know either. Things for making string. Spindle whorls attest the arts of spinning and weaving. Wheat and barley were cultivated from the first, but the earliest bones of ox, horse, sheep, and pig are those of wild species like the gazelle and red deer with which they are associated. There are foxes and wolves, but no dogs. Gradually, however, ox, pig, horse, and two kinds of sheep were domesticated into special breeds. The occurrence of small objects of turquoise and of copper and lead in the later phases of this first culture show that in some regions in which Anau had intercourse, these mineral resources were already exploited, but proves little of nothing as yet. To the relative dates of objects at Anau itself, the human remains which occur at all depths are long-headed, without accepting as more than provisional the first description of them as Negrito or Dravidian. They may be taken as proof of the extension of a South Asiatic type over the West Iranian plateau and its mountain rim. A notable observance of these people was that the burial of young children beneath the house floor. The later part of this culture lies in a phase of gradually increasing drought, and the second culture which succeeds it, or more accurately invades it, rather suddenly, brings a little change in essentials. Sling stones become more common, stone pivots for the doors, and baking ovens made from a large pot. Lapis lazuli and cornelian supplement turquoise, and daggers of copper are found. Agriculture proceeds as before, but the camel, goat, and new hornless sheep and the dog are added to the domestic animals. This and new fabrics of pottery, of smooth red and gray ware, undecorated except for dark smoke mottling on the red ware, suggest wider intercourse with another and in the main more westerly region. This is just what would be expected if drought had disorganized the forests of the highland at its narrowest point, namely between the Caspian and Mesopotamia. For we mainly remember that one of the earliest fabrics of pottery in Syria and Asia Minor is a red ware with various blackened byproducts, and that similar fabric appears in pre-dynastic Egypt. At the end of the second period, Anau had become so dry that the site was abandoned. When it was reoccupied, the settlement was not on the old pile of debris, but on a lower mound a little to the south. The people of this South Kurgan and their habits were the same as of old, including the practice of child burial, but their pottery was now wheel-made and kiln-baked. And its decoration, painted as at the first, was more elaborate. The painted and red ware styles, moreover, had been combined in subsidiary fabrics. The red ware and gray ware have incised ornaments, like the earliest pottery of early Asia Minor and Cyprus, and some of the forms recall those of early North Syrian fabrics. Elaborately incised clay figures of women, cattle, and wheeled carts indicate fresh contact with the grassland to the north and with the North Syrian culture far to the west. The shapes and ornaments of the spindle whorls have a general resemblance to those of Cyprus and Hisarlik. Copper is supplemented by occasional bronze, and the daggers of the second culture by sickles, lances, and arrowheads. There are also arrowheads of flint and obsidian, and ornaments of marble, alabaster, and blue glazed paste like that of Egypt. A single gable-shaped seal stone, with its surfaces engraved respectively with a man and two winged griffins is another link with Assyrian culture, and has even been claimed as of Cretan type. This third culture also was expelled from Anau by a dry spell, more severe than the former one, and the pass was long enough for the deserted mountain to be devastated by rain wash, till the climate improved once more and a fourth culture brought iron objects to Anau, probably not much earlier than Persian times. So detailed a survey of the series at Anau may be justified by several considerations. First, to emphasize its close similarity with the Susan culture in quality and duration, and in the sterile interval between an earlier and later period. On adjacent sites at Anau, but at Susa actually superposed. Secondly, because in the second culture at Susa, which corresponds with the earliest sites on the Sumerian alluvium, a fresh set of influences exemplified in the undecorated red ware and gray ware appears in competition with the old painted ware in much the same way as in the second and third cultures at Anau. Both series point towards a distinct center of culture further west, and the only culture which has such a red ware tradition is that of early Syria, which has ancient relations with Egypt on the one hand and with the highland-girt plateau of Asia Minor on the other. The latter a smaller replica in respect of physical geography of that of Iran. Thirdly, because the more copious use of copper, even in the lowest layers at Susa, and still more in the tombs belonging to it, suggests that in this region, as at Anau, this copper is not originally local, but comes from another source, to which Susa had the earlier access. This again points westward to the Syrian culture, or beyond it. Fourthly, the occurrences of painted ware resembling more or less closely the later stages of the Anau and Susa throughout North Syria in the south, Palestine and Cyprus, where it can be seen intruding into a purely red ware culture, and locally also in Asia Minor, suggests a phase of reaction. Later, as the sequence in Cyprus shows, then the widest expansion of the redware culture, in which the painted redware tradition profoundly affected the Syrian region. This phase cannot be precisely dated yet, but the presence in Egypt under the early dynasties of painted fabrics, alien to the Nilotic styles, probably gives a downward limit for its arrival in Syria, and consequently for the previous spread of the redware culture eastward. The latter, on this reckoning, should not be far from contemporary with the beginning of the dynastic regime in Egypt, and the first culture of Anau would be altogether pre-dynastic. 8. The red ware culture of the Near East. The Nearer East. The red ware culture has already been noted in two connections. Number one, as a source of new elements which are intruded into the second culture at Anau and confront the Susan culture at the phase when it began to spread onto the Sumerian alluvium. And two, on an earlier page, page 79, as the probable source of the redware technique, which has been traced spreading widely over the Danubian region. We have now to define its range and examine its origin. The region over which it seems to be at home extends from Palestine on the south and to Hellespont on the west. They keep using that Hellespont. I mean, I guess it's somewhere in Greece because of the name, but where is that? Hellespont. Okay, so it's... I guess that literally means like bridge to Greece. So I guess that makes sense. It's kind of a connection between Turkey and Greece, it looks like. Wait. Yeah. Okay. So the region over which it seems to be at home extends from Palestine on the south to the Hellespont westward and to the upper Euphrates, or possibly rather further east, covering that is the whole of the Anatolian or peninsular section of the highland zone, together with its Syrian appendage. Between the north end of Arabia and the eastern Gulf of the Mediterranean. The earliest pottery of this region is illustrated best in the first city at Hisarlik, which has only very slight acquaintance with copper, in tombs at Yortan Kwe. I don't know how to say that. Kewi. Yotan Kewi. I don't know. And a number of casual finds all over Asia Minor, and in the lowest layer at the stratified site at Saqqezi in northern Syria. Its forms are partly close imitations of grounds, partly of skin vessels, and the clay is densely blackened and hand burnished. The ornaments are simple bands, triangles, and lozenges, with sparing use of punctured dots within the outlines, also all incised and emphasized with white paste. Locally, this fine blackware degenerates into ashy gray and loses its burnished surface. This early culture seems to be purely Neolithic, with plump pebble-like celts rubbed to a blunt edge, and very little use of flaked flint. With the spread of copper implements, as marked changes take place in technique, black polish gives place to a clear red brick, degenerating to chestnut brown, as the black degenerated to gray. The forms become more gourd-like, open bowls, long-necked jugs with one handle or none, wide-mouthed jars with cylindrical necks and two handles or more. Incised decorations become rarer and is supplemented with ornaments modeled in relief. At Hisarlik, in the second city, many jars have human faces on the neck or on the deep cover which fits over it. Let me see. Hisarlik vases. Because they're talking about Neolithic and Bronze Age, you think it sounds so primitive but then when you look at the things that they're making, it doesn't seem really that primitive at all. These seem pretty nice to me. I couldn't do that. But I guess when they say that some of these had faces, here's one with a face. All right. Whoops. It is in this period that the first exploitations of Cyprus takes place, and it is here, in a culture transplanted fully formed into a fresh locality, that its other characteristics have been most closely observed. Cereal agriculture was practiced, as well as the growing of domesticated gourds. Oxen and sheep were kept. The copper, which is abundant here, was worked extensively and exported. The earliest forms of implement are the flat celt, the leaf-shaped dagger, the longer dagger with a hooked tang to secure it to a wooden haft. The latter is peculiar to this culture, and the former two are common to it and to pre-dynastic Egypt, where the majority of the forms are quite different. The technique also of the red ware is identical with pre-dynastic Egyptian, though its forms are wholly different, even a few gourd forms among the Nile pottery being quite otherwise treated. The question now arises, did Egypt or the Syrian culture originate copper working and transmit it to the other? In Egypt, copper appears as a luxurious adjunct to a highly developed industry of flaked flint, with very little grinding of implements, though hard stones were skillfully worked into vases. And it is only very gradually that flint work declines and copper becomes commoner. The transition is incomplete at the opening of the dynastic series about 4000 BC. In the Asiatic red ware region, a small selection from the Egyptian copper types appears suddenly amid the polished stone culture. Together with the red ware pottery, Syria adds one new type of its own, and then remains long stagnant. There is copper ore in Syria itself, and in many parts of Asia Minor. But it would seem that it was the richer copper of Cyprus, exploited by men of the red ware culture, which excelled competitors and stereotyped these few forms over so large a region. At first sight, the Egyptian copper industry would seem to have priority, but the same question of priority arises as to the origin of cultivation grains, wheat, barley, and millet. Their wild forms are found along the highland zone, from Syria eastward. The same cultivated varieties are already in use from the first at Anau and in pre-dynastic Egypt, but Anau had a very long career before the first eruption of the red ware culture, and had copper from the first. Its domesticated animals, which it acquired some while before the red ware came, are on the one hand derived from local species, and on the other identical with breeds of pre-dynastic Egypt. Had Anau or Egypt priority, or were both indebted to that intermediate region where the red ware culture arose? In the present state of our knowledge of this Middle Kingdom of the Near East, the answer remains in suspense. In another line of advancement, the originality of the Syrian culture is less disputable. It is in the reoccupation It is in the reoccupation of Anau by its third culture that the first clay figures of nude women appear. Where is this? Let's see. It is in the It is with the reoccupation of Anau by its third culture. Wait. Let me see. Anau, third culture. Naked women. Let's see. Do they show anything? No. They show some what look like Egyptian hieroglyphics. They don't show any pottery with images on it, though. Okay. Where did we stop? In another line of advancement, the originality of the Syrian culture is less disputable. It is with the reoccupation of Anau by its third culture that the first clay figures of nude women appear. At Hisarlik, they begin in the first city, and are copious in degenerate clay and stone types, from the second onwards. In southwestern Asia Minor, similarly, they are found in the black ware technique, and beyond the margin of this region, they are part of the repertoire of Neolithic Crete, and of the early Bronze Age of the Cyclades, in the latter case contemporary with the local school of red ware. In Cyprus, they are frequent in the local red ware and even a fairly early phase of it. In other parts of Asia Minor, I just lost my place. In other parts of Asia Minor and throughout Syria, they occur in various early techniques, in more and more traditional and grossly accentuated forms. Though a few female figures in local redware have been found in pre-dynastic Egypt, they are unconventionalized, and even this type had no regular vogue. In Palestine, where it became popular in the Bronze Age, there are only a late and secondary types. In Babylonia, it was known till the time of Hammurabi, and then became popular. It was unknown, in Babylonia, it was unknown till the time of Hammurabi, and then became popular. And Hammurabi's people are thought by some authorities to have come down the Euphrates out of Syria about 2300 BC. In Syria itself alone, on cylinders of rather early date, the conventional type can be traced in course of development. Everything, therefore, points to the creation of this artistic type and of the religious conceptions which it symbolizes. Within the region dedicated to in historic times with the great mother of Asia, with the exception of the figures of Paleolithic women, no relationship with which can be established at present for this Asiatic type. It is the earliest ideal type in history, and the earliest cult of which we know the meaning as well as the symbol. Okay, I have to get some more tea to wet my whistle, so I'll be back in just 1 minute. All right. Whistle is wet. Now we have Part 9, Neolithic and Bronze Age Cultures, the culture of the Eastern Mediterranean. We come now to the last great region and tradition of culture, which remains to complete the survey of our Neolithic cosmos. The Mediterranean itself and the districts interconnected by it. Like the painted ware culture of Western Iran and the redware culture of Syria and Asia Minor, the Neolithic Mediterranean culture passes over so gradually into that of the full Bronze Age. That its development and relationships to neighboring civilizations can only be traced within a broad period of time, as well as over a wide extent of country. Local advancement was unconformable within its limits, and precious varieties overlapped the more belated. And for two of its most prolific areas, currents of influence were projected over and athwart the regions and cultures which have been outlined already, to an extent which has profoundly influenced all subsequent history. Contemporary with the earliest known phase of pre-dynastic civilization on the margins of the Nile alluvium occur rare examples of an alien fabric of pottery, which has provisionally been described as Libyan. That is to say, they are thought to be intrusive from the west. The clay is dark brown or blackish, handmade and burnished. The forms are open bowls and cups, sometimes on 3 or 4 short feet. The ornament is incised in simple geometrical forms, suggestive of basketry, sometimes rather elaborate and always emphasized by careful filling with lines and dots. White paste is used in the black ware of Asia Minor, which shares the liking for tripod supports, but has little love for basketry. Very scattered finds further west in northern Africa link these stray vessels with an amazing wealth of distinct but similar fabrics on Neolithic sites in Malta, representing a long series of development, which culminates later in the great stone-built monuments at Hajir Kim, Menidra, Haltarshian, and Gigantia in Gozo. Oh my, I've never heard of any of those places. Sardinia has another local school and characteristic tripod bases at Angelou Ruju. Sicily has similar but less fantastic fabrics. Self-colored and richly incised at Stentinello and Villafrati. South Italy has others at Matera and Pulo di Molfetta, very early modified, however, by contact with other cultures, which reference is made later. Further north, the Rhone Valley has settlements of similar culture as far inland as the Comte de Chassis near Mâcon. By far the most important regions, however, in which this widespread Mediterranean culture occurs are Crete and Spain. In Crete, below the first Bronze Age layers at Knossos, see chapter 17, which are as old or older than the first Egyptian dynasties and therefore not later than 3500 or 3000 BC, lie Neolithic deposits about 25 feet in thickness. From trial pits in these deposits come self-colored pottery incised with simple linear and dotted ornaments, showing general resemblance both to the other Mediterranean fabrics above mentioned, especially in respect of the vase forms, and also rarer points of correspondence with the Neolithic blackware of Asia Minor. Almost identical pottery occurs locally in cave deposits in the Syrian coast, but nothing similar is known in Cyprus. Further north, in the Aegean Melos, Amorgos, and some other islands, show late and specialized phases of a similar culture already affected by the blackware technique and by the redware of Asia Minor, which superseded it. These Cycladic schools belong to the first period of the Aegean Bronze Age, and they had intercourse with the earliest Bronze Age culture of Minoan Crete. And so directly with Egypt, and may be regarded as contemporary with dynasties 4 through 6, or not later than 2500 BC. Aegean Neolithic culture thus lies in a sort of sea-girt enclave between the blackware culture of Neolithic Asia Minor and the southernmost margin of the great Danubian region in Thrace, Macedon, and northern Greece, and those scattered offshoots of the Transcarpathian painted ware culture which penetrated the Balkan highland and established themselves in the Thessalian plain. Its affinities are almost wholly with the other Mediterranean coastlands. But in default of information from the long stretch of North African coast opposite, which has undergone progressive submergence since the beginning of the Nile alluviation, it is difficult to define its exact relations with its West Mediterranean counterpart, as the Cretan Neolithic was superseded about the beginning of the dynastic Egypt by the Bronze Age Minoan culture. With fresh vase forms, painted decoration, and engraved seal stones, its principal interest is a proof of the very long period occupied by Mediterranean Neolithic period before the dawn of the Minoan. This is in full accord with the occurrence of the Mediterranean types of incised pottery early in the pre-dynastic tombs, with which this section of our inquiry started. For a more detailed discussion of the Minoan series itself in Crete and the Cyclades, see pages 139 and 174 at chapter 17. Its share in the propagation of the bronze-using culture outside its Aegean cradle land is outlined briefly below. Okay. Let's see. So now we are in section 10 of Neolithic and Bronze Age cultures, the culture of the Western Mediterranean and its offshoots. The Great Spanish Peninsula stands in a totally different relation to the Neolithic culture of the West Mediterranean basin from that of Crete in the eastern. It is in itself a little continent of about the same size as Asia Minor, more diverse in its configuration, and of at least equal variety and abundance of resources. Its two great central plateaux drain westwards to the Atlantic, as Phrygia and Cappadocia drain away towards northwards into the Euxine. The northern is more completely isolated and has but a narrow foreshore astride of the Douro mouth. The southern, by the twofold access of the Tagus and Guadiana, communicates with the maritime lowlands of southern Portugal. and is reached with little difficulty also by the headwaters of the Guadalquivir from Andalusia and the Lydia of Spain, back to back with these central plateaux and facing the Mediterranean like Lycia and Pisidia in Asia Minor, and the narrow but very habitable coastline of the Almera and Alicante and Valencia and Balearic chain. Like Rhodes and Cyprus inviting exploration seawards, then comes Catalonia, and counterpart of Cilicia, and the long Ebro trough, cut back far into the continent and opening the back door to the two plateaux of the interior. Finally, around the abrupt end of the Pyrenees and beyond lie more such lowlands with access by the gap of the Carcassonne and the vast coast plain of western France, and by the Rhone to Central Europe. It would perhaps not strain analogy unduly to compare with these the Syrian coast, and in some at least of its early relations with Mesopotamia. Throughout Paleolithic time, this vast region had been the vehicle and recipient of alternate phases of culture, Shellian, Acheulean, Mousterian, and at least one raid of Solutrean from the north, Aurignacian, and afterwards Capsian from North Africa. The twin continent, which has no counterpart in the surroundings of Asia Minor, though its Saharan background has played repeatedly the same part in Western history as Arabia has in the Near East, the long Magdalenian decadence affected the lands south of the Pyrenees, but little and only late. Cave draftsmanship at Altamira and other sites in the northwest achieves finer and mature triumphs, and hands-on eventually its own traditions to eastern and southeastern districts, where the rock shelters show stag, oxen, and perhaps bison, hunted by men armed with bows and arrows, who sometimes fight among themselves, as at Morella, and whose women are shown at Kogul wearing long skirts and engaged in ritual dance. Even here, however, the period of cold moisture with consequent wide extension of forest restricted the descendants of the old hunters to those and a few other sheltered districts. Kitchen middens accumulated along the Portuguese coast, and in the interior, the subsequent deposits are mostly in caves. Rare early examples of broad-headed men show that the new people from the alpine forest region began to spread beyond the Pyrenees, and a considerable population of this type established itself in the district around Mugem in southern Portugal. This crisis past, the whole peninsula was the prize of the next comer, and we have probably to make a large allowance for our defective knowledge of Morocco and all northern Africa in its estimating Iberian originality. The same southeastern coastlands, and especially that of Almeria, acquired early elements of the Mediterranean Neolithic culture and developed it rapidly, with regular settlements round caves and on hilltops, subsisting on the chase with bow and arrow, and on the simple terrace agriculture, like all branches of this Mediterranean culture. But the steep highlands, still heavily forested, prevented expansion into the interior. From similar origins on the coast between Cadiz and Huelva, the Andalusian lowland was exploited with more success. But the main center of advancement was the large lowland of South Portugal. Here, the kitchen midden folk, reinforced as we now have seen by lost tribes of Alpine ancestry, and probably now by settlers from the Andalusian coast plain of the Guadiana, multiplied rapidly and created a culture of their own. Its industries are those of other coast districts, grafted onto those of kitchen middens, but matured early, rapidly, and distinctively in this large and exceptionally favorable region. Most important of all, it is here that we first meet the custom of burying the dead, or at all events, those of more important families in artificial chambers, formed of upright blocks of untrimmed stone and roofed with others, all as large as there was manpower to handle. Originally, they were probably covered with a mound of earth, or at least to the level of the capstone. From rude beginnings, these megalithic burial chambers developed through a well-defined series of forms. The mere chamber, round or polygonal, according to the size of the wall blocks, the chamber with corridor entrance necessarily of some length as the diameter and height of the mound increased, and the corridor with a terminal alcove replacing the chamber, the mere corridor with lateral alcoves or apses, and only after this, by gradual reduction of scale, the mere trench or cyst below, the natural surface lined and roofed with slabs in the ancient way. There seems no need to infer alien influence at any stage. Even the corbelled cupolas, which replace the megalithic capstone, are but another case of necessity, mother of invention. Such works presume cooperation, and no ordinary degree of social coherence in people so constituted and so situated had a whole world at their let me do that again. And people so constituted and so situated had a whole world at their feet. As the climate became drier and the forest more penetrable, they pressed up the great valleys onto the southern plateau, and eventually beyond it into the Ebro Basin, where they found and mastered the backwoods settlements from the Catalan seaboard. They reached the Mediterranean coastline around Valencia. They occupied Andalusia, and were only prevented by the rugged highlands of Granada and Murcia from transforming likewise to the secluded Almeria culture. The latter was to have its turn later on. The great abundance, variety, and excellence of their arrowheads betrayed their chief means of aggression. The growing perfection of their pottery, gray or black polished, incised with white-filled linear ornaments, or skill and beauty, attests to their sense of style. Everywhere, their great burial chambers demonstrate their efficiency and energy. Nor were they checked by the sea. The taliots of the Balearic Islands are a local adaptation of megalithic architecture. Let's look that up. Taliots. Taliots. Let me see. Oh, wait. I'm so bad at typing. Let me try that again. Taliots. 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 Do we have pictures? Okay. Well, it's pretty primitive, but kind of impressive. Okay, it's almost like Stonehenge. Well, that's what it reminds me of. The taliots of the Balearic Islands are local adaptation of megalithic architecture. to a district where soil was too precious for mound building and must be replaced by rubble from the fields. The giants' graves of Sardinia show development from simpler types to the phase where, oh gosh, let me recenter this. Show development from simpler types of the phase when the corridor had outlived its terminal chamber, but not yet developed alcove in its sides. The great monuments of Malta and Gozo show supreme achievement of successive pair apses, dwarfing the corridor, roofed with cupolas of ashlar masonry, and supplied with side doorways cut through a single slab. So, ancient, let's see. Can we find something here? Just pictures of, what did they call it? Great monuments of Malta and Gozo. So let's see. Stone Age, Malta, or Bronze Age. I don't know if it's the Bronze Age or the Stone. Probably Bronze Age. Well, gee, I think that the Balearic architecture was more interesting. Let's see if we can find something more. This doesn't... Maybe it's just because much didn't survive. I don't know if I'm looking at the best examples, but these don't seem that impressive. That one does. That's kind of interesting. Okay. All right. A distant but apparently early outpost is the group of burial chambers in the heel of Italy. Corsica has another such. To what extent the North African coast was occupied, the small, late, and little studied megaliths of Rochnia and Enfida do not clearly inform us. The impressive cenoms of Algeria and Tripoli are now known not to belong to this culture at all, but to oil presses of Roman date, and the megalithic structures of Nubia and Moab have been too little explored to permit more than conjecture as to any affinity with the West Mediterranean culture. They seem to be rather cysts than dolmens, and if so, are comparatively late. What is a cyst? See, I'm afraid to type cyst even if I'm spelling it C-I-S-T-S because I don't know what it will return. Let me ask. Let me see. Earlier, ChatGPT wasn't working. Let's see if it's working now. What is a cyst? C-I-S-T-S. See, it asks me, did you mean cyst? C-Y-S-T? No, I did not. Wait, let me see. Where was it? There were two words. Tripoli, now known to Nubia, little explored, affinity. Where was that word cyst? Oh, okay, well, what if we do dolmen? They appear to be cysts rather than dolmen. Dolmen meaning. A dolmen is a type of megalithic structure consisting of two or more large upright stones supporting a horizontal slab or a capstone. Okay, so a cyst must be some kind of Stone Age architecture, but I can't seem to find any information on it. If you know what a cyst is, please tell me in the comments. That's C-I-S-T, not C-Y-S-T. And if so, are comparatively late. The same applies to a reported group of large stone monuments in eastern Thrace, to those of Crimea, and to another limited and coherent megalithic area on the Pontic coast of Georgia, connected apparently by some isolated examples south of the Caspian with a vast region to the north, to the southeast, including most of India, into the Pacific, where the chambers of similar construction are found sporadically. Though the area exploited by the megalith builders included the whole of the western Mediterranean and perhaps extended beyond it, eastward, and though the total period of this exploitation is shown by successive types of monuments to have been a long one, its influence was not permanent. In Malta, after a brilliant climax in which many concurrent styles of decoration were attempted, including an experiment in spiral ornament, which seemed rather to descend from still earlier Western attempts in Azilian times than to be the result of intercourse either with Bosnia or with the Aegean. The Neolithic culture seems to have been cut off suddenly and in its prime. In Sicily, which is apparently little affected by it, perhaps because its climate and soil made its forests too difficult, except close around Palermo and in the southeastern corner, the primitive Neolithic cultures of Stentinello gave place to a strange and alien first Cecil style at Castelluccio, which arrived fully developed with geometrically painted pottery. First Cecil style. I'm going to see if I can find a picture of what that means. First Cecil style. No, nothing. Okay. Oh well. We don't get to see what that means. Let's see. What if I say Castelluccio prehistory? Castelluccio prehistory. Well, these are the kinds of images you get if you look for Castelluccio prehistory. Some kind of primitive but interesting looking artwork. Oh, but they were talking about architecture. And then if I look for prehistory Sicily Castelluccio architecture, this can't be what they're describing though, because they talked about spirals. And I don't see any spirals here. Whoops. Wait a minute. What if I put the word spiral? Oh, wait a minute. I've got too many windows open now and I'm getting awfully confused here. Okay, spiral. Are these the decorations they're talking about? Those are kind of spirals, but I don't see them on buildings. I'm not sure if that's part of a building or not. No, that's a piece of jewelry, maybe. Huh, okay. Well, we better continue. We better move on. Which arrived fully developed with geometrically painted pottery, which has, oh, they were actually talking about pottery, which has its only near counterpart in immemorial leatherwork design among the peoples of Western and Central Sahara, and in the primitive-looking pottery of the Azores and Kabyle country of Algeria. An African origin for it, as of the Stentinello culture, is supported by the distribution of the characteristic rock-hewn chamber tombs in which it is found. These recur in Malta, where painted pottery of rather different style is found with that of megalith culture, and also in Tunisia. But it must be remembered, on the other hand, that painted ware resembling that of Thessaly occurs in Matera, in the heel of Italy, within the margin, that is, of the megalith culture, though not actually on a megalithic site, and there was certainly intercourse between the painted ware culture of Sicily and the second city of Hissarlik, far away in the northwestern Asia Minor. A peculiar type of carped plaque in bone and ivory being common in both, and occurring also in Neolithic Malta. It might have been expected, and was indeed formally supposed, that the Neolithic culture of Malta and Sicily owed some of its characters to the Aegean initiative, but this has not yet been proved, and at present such correlation as is possible, tends to show that the Western Mediterranean culture long developed independently and was for the most part earlier than the Great Minoan Age. The earliest links are supplied on the one hand by bone plaques already mentioned, which are dated at Hissarlik not later than 2000 BC, and on the other hand, painted by pottery from Matera, which, if it be of Balkan origin, belongs to an even earlier phase. As both these links are subsequent to the spread into Sicily and Italy of the bell beaker culture, to which reference must be next made, they serve to emphasize the relative earliness of the Western culture and its independence of anything Aegean. And it has been noted already that even the Neolithic settlement in Knossos seems rather to be an early northward offshoot of an essentially Mediterranean culture with its cradle in maritime Africa than itself originally Aegean. While the megalith building culture was permeating the West Mediterranean in this way, it was achieving even wider and more arduous expansion northward along the Atlantic seaboard. That this expansion took place mainly coastwise and not overland is suggested by the distribution of the monuments in Western Europe, and especially the different types. Principal early centers are first, and promontory of Britain, whence megalithic enterprise diverges northward to Britain and Ireland, and northeastward past the Low Countries to Denmark and southern Sweden. Secondly, this Scandinavian area, whence the whole of the western half of the North German plain was occupied, as far as the foothills of the Central Highlands. Meanwhile, the whole of lowland France was exploited, mainly up the Atlantic rivers, but also directly by land past the Pyrenees, and probably also from Catalonia along the Mediterranean shore. In Provence and up the Rhone along an earlier line of exploration already noted, that the whole of this vast area remained in fairly full intercourse with the motherland of the megalith culture is clear from the occurrence of the same varieties of tomb plan. In nearly every region, usually in the same order of development, as is shown by the sequence of associated implements, the pottery varies locally within the general uniformity of technique, but the individuals buried in these tombs vary in type, so that it is not possible to speak of a megalith people, but only of a megalithic culture, and a social structure imposed by its originators on the natives among whom they came. In the British Isles, these are more or less pure descendants of Aurignacian and other old long-headed stocks. In Scandinavia and the whole of northwestern area of the continent, they are the tall, massive, long-headed folk who have apparently been developing there since the dispersal of the Cro-Magnon and Solutrean hunters. They seem to be an early offshoot of the tumulus people of southern Russia and are the ancestors of the present Nordic blondes. On the Atlantic seaboard and all across France, there's a mixed population of Magdalenian survivors and Alpine intruders. By this time, much interbred except in the central highland of Auvergne, where the forest remained intact longest, and the Sevenol type of Longhead's purest, and also least affected by the megalithic innovations. To follow the megalithic culture in detail as it made its way up the valleys leading into the central German highland is impossible here. It is essential only to note that the strong forest barrier of the Vosges and Ardennes, and around the headwaters of the Marne, Seine, and Loire, checked progress from the west, while the Rhine and Weser invited intrusion from the north. Consequently, the Rhine and its eastern tributaries, Main and Neckar, early received elements of megalithic culture from the seaboard and greatly modified the old Danubian culture, which had exploited these areas beforehand. A temporary advance of alpine lake dwellers down Rhine was met and repelled, so that the northern elements penetrate even into the lakeland, and with them some Nordic men, further east, and forest frontier of the Danube basin, seems to have held firm for a while, though northern traits were already becoming common locally in pottery and implements before the next crisis came. Further east still, local cultures, more or less clearly based on the northwestern megalithic tradition, established themselves along the upper courses of all the North German rivers as far as the Vistula, but failed, like the Rhenish and Thuringian intruders, to penetrate into Bohemia or Silesia, which remained essentially Danubian. Bohemia, however, was being affected about this period by an alpine outflow similar to those down the Rhine and into northern Italy, all probably due to some passing austerity of alpine climate uncorrelated yet with events elsewhere. And before the crisis with which we have next to deal, Bohemia was also being influenced by the painted ware culture from beyond the Carpathians, so that our survey of events in Neolithic Europe has now returned upon us to its starting point. Not merely was Europe itself by this time plotted out among well-defined regional cultures occupying its principal lowland and less land, but the barriers of highland and forest which had separated those areas hitherto were beginning to break down before human aggression from outside. We distinguished, that is, not merely eventual Hispanic and Gallic provinces on the Atlantic seaboard and eventual Rhineland and Danube land and Bohemian and North German regions distinct from these and from each other, but also historic avenues like those of Carcassonne and Moravia and Lower Rhine. All right, now we are on part 11, the culture of the Beaker folk. Meanwhile, a second impulse originating within the Spanish peninsula was to produce even more far-reaching effects than those due to the megalith builders. A good deal of decoration and some of the forms of all early pottery of the Neolithic Mediterranean, from Portugal to Crete and the Libyan vessels in Egypt, shows the widespread use of various kinds of basketry. This is natural enough when we consider that this culture is bounded southward by the grassland margin of the Sahara, and that most characteristic plant of all this grassland and of the plateau is of Spain itself, the Hafa or Esparto rush, one of the finest materials for basketry in the world. But at a late period in the megalith culture, something more specific occurs, the bell beaker type of pottery, more closely imitated both in form and in size decoration from flexible rushwork vessels, that any earlier or later types is so suddenly intruded among existing Spanish forms and followed by so remarkable a fresh outburst of exploitation that there's much inducement to ascribe it to the intrusion of some fresh stimulus, perhaps from the African side. Let's see, bell beaker vase. I have an idea in my head of what it probably looks like, but let's see. Well, so I guess that is kind of what I pictured. Let me show you what I found here. Something like this, so kind of shaped like a bell or a beaker. Here's another example. So I guess it means, whoops. I don't know. You can see the form here. I'm getting lost. I'm getting tired. I think this is going to be my last section, and then I'm going to finish because I'm getting tired. Okay. Let's see. So we'll go back. Those are the bell beakers. Like the medieval coming of the Moors, whatever the cause, the effects are certain. Overrunning all parts of the peninsula and reaching the Mediterranean localities, so remote as Sardinia, western Sicily, and Remedello near Brescia. In the far northeast of Italy, the bell beaker culture crossed the Pyrenees and penetrated almost all districts of France, following the old coastal route to Brittany. It passed over to Britain and Ireland, and affected also profoundly the large region beyond the Netherlands, which the megalith builders had already made their own. That it was not a mere distribution of trade objects is clear from the fact that the bell beakers themselves are of local materials and various techniques. That it was not only the Hafa baskets themselves that were traded and imitated locally, though this too is probable, is shown by the simultaneous appearance of other kinds of objects, and by shifts, not merely of whole provinces of culture, but of the frontiers of physical types. In the same direction as the spread of the bell beakers, which, whenever they appear, are a storm signal of profound disturbances from Denmark to Budapest. It has even been doubted whether those at Remedello are transmarine or transalpine intruders. Neglecting, as before, the bewildering details where they are known, and supplementing provisionally the no less baffling scarcity of data at some important points, we may yet present a general outline of the course of the bell beaker movement and its principal effects. In general, the bell beaker movement followed the main lines of the megalithic culture, overtaking it, however, on its frontiers and passing beyond them. In one respect, however, it created a new situation altogether. For whereas in eastern France the megalithic advance had been held up by the forested highlands, while west of the Rhine, the bell beaker folk, better organized and better armed, especially with highly developed archery, forced this barrier, perhaps already weakening by previous clearings, towards its main gaps, north and south of the Vosges, and broke through into the Danube valley. We may speak confidently here of invasion, because the change of culture is not only sudden, but is accompanied by replacement of the old Rhenish and Danubian population by the moderately broad-headed stock, which had long been characteristic of the region of the Atlantic drainage. The open villages and peaceable habits of the Danubian valley folk made them easy prey. Remnants of them survived here and there in the foothills of the central highland. But this barrier also was obsolete, and the northern and western groups of Bell Beaker folk coalesced as they advanced and occupied even the secluded Bohemian area. Further east, still parts of Silesia remained in occupation of a Danubian remnant, but a Bell Beaker has been found as far downstream as Budapest. The main flood of invaders, however, was stayed in the more hilly country between Bohemia and the Austrian Alps, where the valley narrows and the old Alpine culture with its secure lake settlements offered better resistance and diverted the invaders northward into Bohemia and Moravia. This long secluded region now became the center of a fresh movement, the origin of which is obscure, though its results were revolutionary. Its population was by this time chaotically mixed, partly Old Danubian, partly Alpine, partly Western invaders, and perhaps partly of more easterly and southeasterly origin, for the tumulus building steppe folk, as we have seen, displaced the Tripolier culture from Galicia. Seems to have pressed forward thus far about this time, while their southern kinsfolk made chaos in the Balkan lands, and out of this crucible of diverse stocks a new and remarkable type of man emerged, broad-headed like the Alpines, heavy-browed like the steppe people, with massive square faces and jaws like the men of the Old Northwest, and with something of the high-vaulted brain case of the Dinaric and Baltic Roundheads. Their industries were in the main those of the Bell Beaker culture, and their East Alpine connections kept them in remote touch with the nascent copper culture of Italy. But they buried their dead in cist graves. Okay, here's that word cist again, but now it's with a word that may be cist grave. Because I tried to look up this word cyst earlier, C-I-S-T, and all it says is, did you mean cyst? C-Y-S-T. But, obviously it's some kind of construction design or construction technique or something like that, because it's always used in reference to constructing things. And maybe even constructing things with stone. Okay. Their industries were, in the main, those of the Bell Beaker culture, and their East Alpine connections kept them in remote touch with their nascent copper culture of Italy. But they buried their dead in cist graves resembling the latest megalithic tombs, covered, however, by conspicuous earthen tumuli, not oval like the long barrows of Neolithic Britain, but circular like those of the steppe people. It is one of the few instances where a new kind of man has come into existence under conditions where the antecedents are in any degree knowable, and whose racial history expresses so clearly the qualities of the brain within the new type of skull. It was apparently not long before the round barrow folk, as we may conveniently call them, outgrew their Bohemian cradle and dominated the Danube Valley and much of the eastern Alps, coalescing with the already mixed folk, Alpines, Western invaders, and Danubian remnants, whom they found there. Westward they spread into Thuringia. Is that Thuringia? Thuringia? Oh gosh. Let's see. Thuringia. Pronunciation. Thuringia. Now I'm wondering about, what was it? Vosges? Vosges. I bet it's Vosges. 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 Okay. Thuringia. All right. Where was Thuringia? Eastward into the Hungarian and Galician lowlands. But their main achievement was to the northwest, where they overran the lowland as far south as the Seine and penetrated into Denmark and Scandinavia and built their round barrows in South Sweden and southwestern Norway. At the estuaries of the Elbe, Weser, and Rhine, they took to the sea and occupied the eastern districts of Britain from the Thames and to the Forth, driving the long-headed folk of the long barrows into the forest, but not disturbing the more civilized megalithic folk of Kent and the south and southwest. Here, too, round barrows indicate their distribution, and the beaker types of the pottery in them clearly betray their affinities. And wherever they went, they settled and have remained the ancestors of John Bull type of Englishmen and the kindred continental stocks. The old long-headed Nordic people whom they disturbed partly coalesced with them, partly enlarged their own borders northward at the expanse of the representatives of the old Arctic culture, till they were checked partly by the climate, partly by the Mongoloid ancestors of the Lapps, who had been working their way round the head of the Baltic as soon as the shrinkage of the last Swedish glaciers made this possible. In the Mediterranean, the bell beaker culture produced comparatively small effects, so far as our present information goes. It reached Sardinia and Sicily, but apparently not Malta, and there are no traces of it in North Africa, on the North African coast. And its vogue appears to have been short. There seems to be a good reason for this, for as the West Mediterranean and even the Mediterranean coast of Spain itself began now to come under fresh influence, which was to change the whole outlook of the region, it is only in this direction that we may hope to gain even relative dates. The movement which initiated the Minoan Bronze Age culture in Crete and the Cyclades does not seem to have been confined to the Aegean. Its sources were multiple and are not to be sought only in Egypt, though intercourse between the Nile and Crete was early, active, and persistent. The implements in the pottery, both red and painted, have much in common, as their very names of these styles imply, with Asia Minor and Syria, and with the far easterly culture which penetrated the regions early. Further west, the connecting links are scanty, but the fact that copper working began early in southeastern Spain, and that the first copper implements there are the leaf-shaped dagger and the flat celt, and that with the copper appear fresh vase forms and an imperfect redware technique, which spread rapidly and widely, suggests that this Western copper industry was not an independent discovery, but resulted from intercourse with the Levant. It was not, however, the bell beaker regime of the plateau, but the smaller, more secluded, and hitherto more backward culture of the Almeria coastland, which acquired and exploited the new knowledge. And the reason for this is certainly the wealth of copper ores in the coast ranges of Murcia and Granada, near enough to the sea to be accessible to prospectors, well supplied with timber for fuel, and perhaps also provided for the same source with seafaring vessels and oversea connection of its own. Once introduced, the new industry developed rapidly. Improved types of implements were designed, and the discovery, perhaps accidental, that certain ores yielded a yellower metal, resembling the gold which already circulated as a rarity in Neolithic Spain, led to the employment of this for ornaments, which were traded into the interior, and for some while before the new alloy, as this yellow bronze was later discovered to be, was used for implements also when its greater toughness was appreciated, and produced designedly with the aid of tinstone. This mineral is widely distributed in certain districts of the far interior, and was soon traded to the copper-working districts, and eventually also abroad. At Hissarlik, bronze is found in the second city, not later than 2000 BC, and probably a good deal earlier in weapons of Asia Minor type. In Egypt, it appears first under the 5th dynasty, not later than 2800 BC, and in Crete it goes back earlier still, almost to the beginning of the Minoan series. Here, therefore, Spanish priority in discovery cannot be proved. Here also, therefore, Spanish priority in discovery cannot be proved. The transmission of knowledge is far more difficult to detect than the transport of commodities, but it is significant that in the tombs of Angelou Ruju in Sardinia, which belong to a pre-metallic stage and have a purely Western culture, 10 out of 63 bodies are not of Mediterranean type, and are indistinguishable from the broad-headed stock of Asia Minor, which certainly was entering eastern Crete early in the Minoan age, and must therefore be presumed to have already been some seafaring skill. These Sardinian immigrants had not been there long, for there had not been time for them to mix their blood much with the natives. Other patches of broad-headed folk have been recognized in Gerba Island off western Tripoli, and in the hill country of northeastern Tunis. But the earliness of their arrival here has not been demonstrated. In Spain, direct evidence of such prospecting aliens has not been recorded yet. It can hardly be accidental, however, that the nascent copper industry in the West is accompanied, like that of Asia Minor and Cyprus, by active production of silver. This metal, however, was for long of local importance, mainly the ease with which it tarnishes in a moist climate, making it far less popular in the Northwest. Another invention, this time definitely Spanish, did much to popularize the Western metal industry. The leaf-shaped dagger, already broadened at the base, was fixed transversely, like a flat celt, in the long handle and halberd, I don't know. So constructed was in the wide, let me start over. In a long handle, and the halberd so constructed was in the wide demand. Together with Western types, elongated or expanded celts, the triangular dagger itself, and a longer sword-like blade, it was introduced into Italy, where the discovery of copper ores in Elba and Etruria set that peninsula fairly soon on an independent career. While its nearness of the great Danubian province, now mainly dominated, as we have seen, by people of the bell beaker culture gave it an insatiable market for its metalwork, traded against Baltic amber and perhaps tin from central German highland. Later on, the Danube basin, and particularly the Hungarian region of it, began to exploit its own wealth of ore and fuel, and created a culture of its own. But Central and Northwestern Europe long depended almost exclusively on Italian models, and in great part on Italian traffic. As in the West Mediterranean, so along the Atlantic seaboard, the Spanish metal traffic with its special series of forms followed in the wake of the bell beaker culture. Habards of early Spanish type have been found on the upper Danube and were widely copied in the northwest as far as Ireland. It appears to have been about the time of the Bohemian Exodus that the knowledge of copper began to penetrate into Western and Central Europe. In the West, mainly from Spain, so in the wake of the bell beaker folk, into the upper Danube Valley, in the center mainly from Italy, greatly aided apparently by the arrival near Brescia and elsewhere in northeastern Italy, and eventually as far south as Latium, of parties of people exhibiting mixed alpine and Danubian physique and burying their dead contracted in earthen graves. In old Danubian fashion, as a similar settlement has been near Landshut in the Inn Valley, it looks as if the famous in Adige route across the Alps was already in use and in the hands of people from the north side. It must be reserved for a later chapter to describe the improvements in copper and bronze objects which were made there, and how they were imitated in local factories north of the Alps. As northern ores were discovered and copper working spread, here it is sufficient to note that in all the earliest and some of the most important of the later types, such as the socketed Celt, Italy supplied the models of all Central Europe, from the Carpathians to the Rhine, and competed by way of Savoy and the Rhone Valley with the Spanish types, which were already current further west. Far to the southeast, it is true, the copper and bronze of Western Asia Minor seem to have been traded into Balkan lands through the second city of Hissarlik, and indirectly this traffic may have extended far from amber occurs in the second city, and Celts, daggers, and pins. Spiral-headed with an eyelet in the stem, and all common to Hissarlik, Cyprus, and Syria, are found in early lake dwellings in Austria. But the disturbances due to the dispersal of the painted ware people from Ukraine and to the inroads of the tumulus folk seem to have dislocated this traffic for a while. And it's not until much later, when the late Minoan culture had at last reached the Hellespont, that the north shores of the Aegean, not much before 1300 BC, that its highly developed swords, perforated axe heads, and characteristic spiral decoration began to influence the bronze work of Hungary and eventually Denmark and Scandinavia. Considerably earlier than this, however, and probably not much later than the days of the second city of Hissarlik, Aegean explorers began to sail westward and penetrate into the western Mediterranean. Occasional finds betray their intercourse with South Italy as early as the Middle Minoan period, not later than 2000 BC, trading with the Lipari Islands for a rare decorative mineral, influencing the local pottery of Casabile in Sardinia, and making at least one voyage as far as Marseille. Their bronze swords of rather late date Their bronze swords of a rather late date reached Sicily when the painted Cecil style was in its decline. In the late Minoan period, after 1400 BC, they had regular settlements on the east coast of Sicily and another at Tarentum. Their wares now reached the head of the Adriatic and influenced the native metalwork of Este on the old Adige route to the north of Etruria, probably by way of Bologna, which was then the great center of intercourse between northern Italy and central Italy. Okay, I think I have to stop here. I'm getting tired. So, thank you, those people who watched all the way through. That's pretty amazing. And I'll see you next time with more Cambridge Ancient History. And we'll be on Chapter 2, Part 13, the Hallstatt Culture. Okay, I will see you then. Goodbye.